SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everybody. Let's continue with our discussion in this week of sensibility and passion with specific reference to the poetry of the Romantic period, 1798 to 1832. In our previous session, we spoke about the rise of the literature of sensibility and the kind of paradox at the heart of Romantic writing, sensibility and passion, which constitutes both reason and sentiment mixed. In the age of sensibility, the irregular, the fragmented, the unruly, even the nervous becomes not only aesthetically desirable but morally superior to regularity, completion and order, the triumph of sentiment over the condition of rational thinking. Now the question was, if sensibility is linked to virtue, ethics and morals, why is it that most humans lack these? In other words, if to be a virtuous being I have to have sensibility, passion and reason mixed, how come more humans aren't human in that sense? Please recall what we have said. To be human is to have a sensibility towards suffering. How come, as Hobbes suggested, human beings were fundamentally selfish? The Romantics needed to address this question. It was not easy to say, no, that's not quite relevant, because as Thomas Hobbes demonstrated throughout his career, substantial career, human beings are fundamentally selfish. We are only interested in power. We are only interested in ourselves. We are not interested in the world outside. The Romantics and the writers of sensibility in this period address this problem by making a case for rustic simplicity as a source of true sensibility. That is, it's only within the rural population, within the rural humans, that there is true sensibility. People in the city are already morally corrupt and depraved. In other words, you create a very smart, very clear binary. The pure, uncontaminated country and the maligned, corrupt and contaminated city. That's point one. But there was also a concern that passions were transmissible. David Hume, the philosopher, believed that passions are contagious and communicable. As he put it, they pass with the greatest facility from one person to another and produce correspondent movements in all human breasts. On this point, let's turn now to William Wordsworth in Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Coming up next on your slide is a short excerpt from Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. And please recall what we have said. The binary between the corrupt, morally depraved city and the pure, passionate, authentic rustic life. This is Wordsworth in Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Please read that excerpt carefully. Low and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. Note what he's saying at the first level itself. They are people where the essential passions of the heart are rooted, find a better soil. In that condition, the passions of men are incorporated with beautiful and permanent forms of nature. What is Wordsworth talking about? Having said that there is a binary between London or any metropolis and the rustic, and you will see this in poems like Wordsworth's Upon Westminster Bridge, where he will say that the great heart of London lies still. What Wordsworth is talking about in this short excerpt you have just seen on your slide from the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads is the incorruptibility of the rustic. The rustic mind and heart therefore become the central, the core tenets of the Romantic theory of sensibility and passions. Byron's passionate heroes are also divided personalities, implying that there is an overabundance of passion that can also be hard to deal with. Having noted this example from Wordsworth, I should also perhaps address the fact that the age of sensibility was not uniform and unified. There was frequently a tension between optimism and pessimism. Many were undecided between social change and a conservative worldview, but most importantly, they were caught between virtue as natural and virtue as cultivated. That is, am I born virtuous, or is virtue cultivated slowly through cultural training and education and the society in which I live, between people who are born good and people who, shall we say, achieve goodness. But the Romantics were also caught between the tension between wanting social change, having better people, but worrying about what kind of change it would be. That is, you want social change, but you are not sure that the social change is what you and I will like. There is a terror of the social change as well. The Gothic, which arises during this period, critics have noted, is a genre devoted to the excess of passion. It was revived with all its insistence on ancient coasts and buildings and events, precisely as a device to ward off the uncertainties of present passion, such as the French Revolution. The skeletons and demons in old closets and resurrections of archaic, unsocialized passions must have reassured a complacent British public. This also meant, commentators note, a distrust of civil society and urban life. The new moral aesthetic, building on the literature of sensibility, building on the idea of passion and the caution against excessive sentiment, left no room for more urban forms of virtue. Urban sophistication was inherently untrustworthy. Erudition is for abuse, civility is a form of dishonesty, and those with education were seen as the most skilled at deception. It is in this context that the idea of the noble savage and the virtuous primitive emerged in the late 17th and 18th centuries. The rise of sensibility treated the ancient world, and I am moving on quickly to the next one. I will return to the question of the noble savage in the next slide. The rise of sensibility treated the ancient world as purer and closer to the passions than the modern, implying that civilization corrupts the passions. This is something you will also recognize. People of every generation complain that there was a golden age before the present generation came. This present generation is corrupt, they don't like them, they don't understand them. But it remains that every generation believes this of itself and of the preceding and the future generations. So in the Romantic age, they believe that there was an ancient world, purer, authentic as compared to what we are now. The works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and poetry, such as Thomas Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry, Macpherson's Poems of Ossian, praise the ancient world for this reason. I now turn, coming up on your next slide, to Rousseau. Please take a look at this. Before art had shaped our manners, and taught our passions to speak an artificial language, our customs were rustic but natural. Please recall what Wordsworth has said, in which we have already looked at in an earlier slide, that it is in the rustic life that you see authentic human passion. That's what Rousseau is also saying. Rousseau is arguing that before we came into civilization, before we were civilized, or in a manner of speaking, trained, our customs may have been crude, may have been rustic, but they were natural. The point is, there is an anxiety incipient in people like Wordsworth that our education, formal and informal, our civilization is actually taking us further away from our natural virtuous state. We need to cultivate it in certain ways. Passions can be the foundation for the moral and ethical, but, and this is the crucial part, it means not all of us have it, as in not you and I. It requires a special kind of person to possess passions. For Wordsworth, passions are moral and ethical, or rather they form the foundations for the moral and ethical. In Wordsworth, they are a means of receptivity or sensitivity to external situations and sights, whether it's Tintern Abbey or war or whatever it might be. Throughout his poetry, Wordsworth would posit the poetic mind as one more receptive to the world. And again, to return to his key text, Preface to the Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth would say that all of us will listen to poetry, all of us have this, but only certain kinds of people will have the mindset. And in Tintern Abbey, he will say that. Here it is. Coming up on your slide, Tintern Abbey, an excerpt rather. Please read those lines carefully. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as a landscape to a blind man's eye. But oft in lonely rooms and amid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensation sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. And note the line after that, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration, feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as I have no slight or trivial influence. What is Wordsworth actually doing? Wordsworth is speaking about sensation sweet, which is a phrase from the poem. Those sensations he feels in the blood, along the heart. And then he says, but they also pass even into my purer mind. Wordsworth is very emphatic that sensations, passions are both about heart and mind. He continues in Tintern Abbey to elaborating this response, as you can see. Please read your next slide as well. In the supplement to the 1815 preface, Wordsworth would say, the appropriate business of poetry, her appropriate employment, her privilege and her duty is to treat things not as they are, but as they appear. Not as they exist in themselves, but as they seem to exist to the senses and the passions. In other words, what Wordsworth is talking about is, you need not describe things as they are there. This is a mountain, this is a river, and so on and so forth. You should rather ask, how do they appear to my eye? How do they exist in my senses? He also believed that passions needed to be controlled. In tempering and restraining the passion to produce poetry, is what he writes in the later preface to the Lyrical Ballads. In poems like Strange Fits of Passion, Have I Known, Wordsworth keeps a very tight control over the meter as a way of demonstrating the passion inside him. But all this seems to suggest that there was this undiluted passion and admiration for sentiment. And there was also an anxiety for passions that could become and produce restlessness. That is, if you recall what we have said in the previous point about the Gothic as dealing with the excess of emotion and excess of passion, there was an anxiety in the Wordsworth era that passions could perhaps produce restlessness. In The Recluse, Wordsworth would write, here it is, must turn elsewhere and travel near the tribes and fellowships of men, see ill sides of passion ravenous from each other's rage. Look at those wordings, of passions ravenous from each other's age. Must hear humanity in fields and groves pipe solidarity anguish, or must hang brooding over the fierce confederate storm of sorrow, barricaded evermore within the walls of cities. May these sounds have their authentic comment, that even these hearing I be not heartless or forlorn. What is Wordsworth doing here? Wordsworth is worrying about passions ravenous from each other's rage, passions that feed off each other, and the fact that humanity comes very close to declaring war over things like excessive passions. Later in the supplement to the 1815 preface, he would write, Wordsworth would add, the appropriate business of poetry, her appropriate employment, her privilege and her duty is to treat things not as they are, but as they appear, not as they exist in themselves, but as they seem to exist to the senses. What is Wordsworth doing here? Wordsworth's emphasis on the passion is something he's tempering, as in he's reducing its effect by saying, yes, we understand the passions are like this, that we are driven to passion in certain moments of time. But is that a feature of the thing itself? Is that a feature of whatever you're perceiving, you're holding up? No, it depends on how they appear, what they appear as. So in short, it is only via our senses that we see the world. It's only via our sight, sound that we perceive the world. It's not about whether they exist independent of us, but they seem to exist because of us within our senses and passions. In short, what we have been talking about here is the fact that poetry is about the engagement of the senses. It's about the engagement of the passions to something you see. Which comes first? We cannot say. Is it the natural object that comes into being before we do? If it does come into being before us, how does anybody recognize it unless we share cultural training? The important thing to take away from this lesson is that there is a complicated nature of relationship between the passion / sentiment and reason / intellect. It requires certain evolved minds to cultivate the passions. Passions cannot be left to run the way they want. That's not possible. You cultivate them, you train them. Do you think that's contradictory to what Wordsworth has been saying? At some point you begin to ask yourself, Wordsworth has been talking about spontaneous overflow. Nothing about this is spontaneous. If you have thought about it, you have discovered the contradiction here or the paradox here, that on the one hand he speaks about spontaneous overflow, powerful feelings, all of that. At the same time, Wordsworth will also argue that this is a result of training of some kind. There is a history to how our senses have evolved. Thank you.